Welcome. This is the third in the series of the reviews I am doing as Mr. Blake for AP Human Geography. And this particular chapter was focused on the concept of migration, people moving through space. There are any of a number of topics that come out of here that would make really decent essay questions, as well as probably a good, I'd say probably maybe eight multiple choice questions will likely come from this particular chapter. So it's going to behoove you to go back. And this is one where you probably have to do a little bit of studying because it's been a while for one. And it's really hard to tell what they might pick up on as a particular question. So this is one where it's probably going to go back, look over your notes, go back and look at over the old tests and stuff, and try to remember what you know and what you don't know on this one. The big thing that comes out of migration is why do people migrate and where do they go and why are they leaving? This is going to be dealing with push-pull factors. You have to be able to identify push factors, the negative, the pull factors that pull somebody to a particular destination. The way that they are making their migration, which could be they're doing it in one leap. Are they doing it in multiple steps to get there? So you may be looking at something like step migration, going from country to country until you reach your destination. You got to look at the distance that they're going. Are they going internationally? Is this an intra-regional thing where they're just moving within a region, perhaps? Are they going inter-regional, maybe from one region to another? So you need to look at the distances too, and people will move different distances for different reasons, especially as countries develop. So keep that in mind. Your international, interregional, intra-regional migrations, because they may tell you something as to what's going on in that society. Just to think about that in sort of terms like that, think about developmental levels. Going back to chapter one, for instance, and chapter two, if you see that a country is developing, if they're starting the urbanization process, if they are starting the industrial process, people are moving to the cities, and that's a migration right there. It's going to be the big one, going from the farms to the cities is going to be one of the biggest migrations anywhere in the world that is going to take place. And it tells you something that they have reached that stage that they're developing. People are coming into the cities. Most of that is going to be intra-regional, meaning that people are moving to the closest city where industrialization is taking place. Which city? Gravity model. The bigger the city, the chances are that those farm or agrarian peoples are going to be moving to that closest, biggest city. And so think about that. That'd make a great topic for an essay. Anyway, but going from farm to city, that's the big migration. Most of it going to be intra-regional, maybe some interregional, some international. So people may be coming in from another country because this country is industrializing and this one isn't, and so that's where the jobs are. So you'll have some international migration taking place. When you go another step in the development on the DTM, if you're looking at stage three, we're an industrialized society. And so what's happening here is you're going to continue from this point forward. You're still going to have people moving from the farms to the cities. You're going to have people moving internationally to the cities. You're going to see some other migrations, though, taking place at stage three. At stage three, people start moving into the suburbs. We've reached that stage of technology that we will have settlements on the outside of cities. And so you're going to start seeing people moving from the urban areas to the suburban areas. At stage four, they start moving into the exurbs and back to the farm country. That's counter urbanization. They're moving away from the cities and now into small towns and farm country. And again, there's been a change in technology. Computers, telecommunications allows us to do jobs out in Madisonville, Texas, in the middle of nowhere, where we might have had to have an office in a downtown building previously. So we would have to have lived close to the city. We also deal with the folks that don't want to live in the suburbs or in the cities. They want a rural lifestyle. They like that. That's the culture they want. And so they will move out to farm country so they can raise horses and cows and pigs and whatever else. But they're probably also engaged in some sort of activity other than farming, some sort of business that they can do over a computer through telecommunications and stuff. And that allows that to happen. And that's a relatively recent development. People are moving from the city suburbs out to the rural, that counter urbanization. Again, makes great part of an essay, possibly. So something to think about there. When we're looking at migration, think about, especially in step migration, are there obstacles and opportunities that might end a migration early? So maybe I'm a Guatemalan migrant trying to go to Canada, and I've managed to get through, let's say, Mexico. But when I hit the United States, there's a whole bunch of legal barriers for me crossing from Mexico into the United States. It may well be I stop right there. I cannot overcome those legal barriers to get to Canada. And so I may end up settling in, let's say, northern Mexico, or I may get discouraged and just go home. So that would be an obstacle, and it could be a physical obstacle. It could be a legal obstacle, could be an economic obstacle. I simply run out of money, and I may not be able to finance the rest of my migration to wherever it was that I was going. So I may be forced to kind of settle where I am. In most cases, if any of these cases, most of the migrants are still planning at that point to reach their destination, but they have to stop for some reason. And as time goes on, it becomes less and less likely that they're going to make that journey. And so eventually they kind of settle into where we go, or wherever they have gone. Think about Denver again. All of my stories about people trying to get to California and they stop in Denver and they never actually leave Denver. And so that becomes a barrier to their migration. But it may be, in a positive sense, that they found that they could have a pretty decent life in Denver or Colorado Springs or something, that they open up a business and it's thriving. And why would you want to walk away from a thriving business? So you end up settling in that area. And so in this particular case, an intervening opportunity came along and they can improve their lives that way, even though they didn't manage to get to San Francisco and the gold fields and all that mess, which probably wasn't going to work out anyway. So it was probably just as well they stayed in Denver. So keep that in mind. Another thing is, if we're dealing with push factors, remember how to describe people who are impacted by some sort of push factor. Again, these are all going to be negative, always. It could be, again, environmental disaster, war, famine, disease, could be anything, political repression, genocide, you name it. Something bad is happening and you had to get out of Dodge. And so when you fled, you have to remember how to classify these people. Did they cross an international boundary looking for protection, for instance? That would make them a refugee. They have officially crossed international lines into another country, and often they are applying for assistance, help, protection. That would be somebody that is seeking some sort of amnesty, for instance, that they may apply for amnesty. And usually the folks that are applying for amnesty are those that are subject to persecution, political, possibly religious, cultural, racial, sexual. Oh, look, here's another gender topic that could come up. But you're asking another country to protect you in their laws from something that's going on in your homeland. And so you may have the question of what kind of person would be seeking amnesty or asylum. They may request asylum, same sort of thing. They're trying to find somebody that will protect them. It's usually not economic, it's usually something else. If they did not cross international lines, they're an internally displaced person, meaning that they're still living in the same country, but they're not living where home is, because whatever home is a disaster right now and they can't go back. So, for instance, the Katrina folk of Hurricane Katrina out of New Orleans, many of them fled to Texas or Arkansas or somewhere else. They would not have been considered refugees by the UN or international organizations. They would have been considered internally displaced persons because they never left the United States. They're just moving to some other part because home is a disaster. You may see this also in war. There's a lot of internally displaced persons in places like Syria, um, Iraq. We have seen this a lot right now. Ukraine, you have a lot of internally displaced people as well as people who have fled to other countries as refugees. I bring this up because in multiple choice questions, you'll often get what seems the same kind of answer that you can't figure out which one's right. You've got to look at the status of the people. Did they cross an international boundary or not? That may help you determine what answer that could be. And it could be a proper term that you could use in an essay as well. And that may earn you a point because you described the refugee properly. So, something to know. Um, Other things, voluntary, involuntary migration. Voluntary is almost always a pull factor that you're going somewhere because that's going to make your life better. I'm going to get a better education. I'm going to make more money at that job. There's more jobs available. So I'll have some choices. Maybe the climate's better than where I am now. I'm going to be happier there. So there's a destination, and that would be largely voluntary. You chose to make that move. Involuntary are things like slavery, being kids that are getting moved by your family because mom or dad maybe got a better job somewhere else. Now, for them, that would be considered a voluntary thing, but you as the kid probably didn't have any choice in that matter. So you're an involuntary migrant. Refugees are involuntary migrants. They didn't want to leave their village. It fell under artillery attack, so they had to leave. And so again, it's a negative. You didn't want to do that. You have to do that. And so when you're looking at involuntary migration, it is either because of a push factor or because that person just simply doesn't have a say in the fact that they're migrating or not. Um, this is also going to cover a whole lot of the American migrations. You may have questions about very specific migrations in U.S. history. You're probably going to want to look over those again. And as I said in class, one of the things that might help is look at these major migrations, maybe mentioned in the text and stuff, and put them on a timeline. Say that, this is when the Germans arrived, this is when the Irish arrived, this is when the Swedes arrived, this is when the Italians, the Chinese, and everybody else, Vietnamese, Cubans, whoever they are, put them on a timeline. Probably you know where they came from, but figure out where they were going to. Why did they leave? And is it still going on? Is it a past thing? What impact did they have in the part of the United States that they settled in? So, if you're looking at Chinese migration up on the West Coast, you're going to see that the Chinese culture is still evident in places like the Little Chinas in LA and in San Francisco and Seattle. You have Vietnamese communities in Los Angeles and Houston. And anytime you have immigrants coming into an area, they're going to bring their culture with them. This is again cultural diffusion, going back to the first chapter again. And so be able to explain that. Why do we suddenly have Vietnamese culture in places like Houston? What's the long-term consequences of that? And if you can answer that question, which is you have Vietnamese communities, you see signs in Vietnamese, there's Vietnamese businesses appealing directly to Vietnamese customers, Vietnamese restaurants everywhere, so on and so forth. But also think about it in terms like this. If I am a migrant, especially if I am an economic migrant, I am coming for work, right? And regardless of whether or not I came here originally for work or not, even if I'm a refugee, I still have to take care of myself and my family, right? I'm going to have to do something for work. So, one of the questions you need to think about is where do migrants generally fit into the economic system of the country that they're moving into? And since many of them are often not particularly well educated. They're not particularly wealthy. They're coming to a new society that they don't know very well. They may not be able to speak the language. It will be that the lower rungs of the economy tend to be where they move into to do that kind of work. And so, if you've ever wondered why we have all the lawn care guys that seem to come from Mexico or Guatemala or Peru or whatever, there's a reason for that. Most people don't like maintaining their own lawn. They're willing to pay somebody else to do it, but it's dirty, hot jobs. They don't pay particularly well. But if you're a migrant and you're looking for work, construction work, landscaping work, being a domestic servant in a house, let the wealthy people pay you stuff. They may not pay you much, but it's probably in more than you were making when you were at home, wherever that was, because that may be the reason why you left in the first place. But you often see migrants taking those lower rungs of society jobs, and then they will climb up, and then their children will be so much better off because they're starting at this point rather than this point. And within a generation or two, they're just like everybody else in that society. Think about that process. It would be an interesting essay question. Hmm. Um, Other things, remember Zelensky and Ravenstein. I'd look over Ravenstein's laws, who moves, where are they moving to, that sort of thing. So again, think about the gravity model. Why do migrants go to bigger cities and smaller cities unless there's something there that they would want to go to? Maybe they have family there or something. But if it's just a matter of choosing between two cities, they'll go with the bigger one. But look at Ravenstein. Who did he think was migrating? Why were they migrating? What kind of migrant were they? Then look at Zelensky's model of all the stages of development. Where are people moving? And this goes into the international, rural to urban, all of that stuff. So Zelensky and Ravenstein, if you have any questions involving migration, especially on an essay, think about those two guys because they may be able to help you answer those questions. Certainly in multiple choice if they're asking about them, but think about how they might be useful in any of your essays that are dealing with migration movement issues. If I was to say which migrations would I really pay attention to, aside from the big internationals like the Irish and the Chinese and the Italians and stuff like that, look at interregional migrations like to the Sun Belt, going from the northern states to the southern states, change in technology. We have air conditioning and stuff. So suddenly those southern states aren't so bad anymore. And it doesn't snow there. So I can move my business to the south, have an air conditioned factory. So I'm not killing everybody in the heat. And now people will start moving because that's where the factories are. So that's interregional migration, Sunbelt migration, great migration at the beginning of the 20th century, going from the southern states to the northern states. In this case, we're looking at the African American community moving out of the South and going to the big urban areas of the North, Detroit, Chicago, New York, whatever. Again, economic reasons, but also the fact that they didn't want to live under Jim Crow. And so they would find themselves more accepted in a society in, let's say, Chicago or Pittsburgh or something than, let's say, Birmingham, Alabama, or Atlanta, Georgia. And so they're fleeing, if you will, the racism and bigotry of the South and moving into more accepting areas. But it's also a pull factor because that's where the jobs were. So probably more it's a pull than a push. But it is the reason why that interregional migration took place. You're also looking at things like Manifest Destiny going from east to west, again, seeking economic opportunities in the West. We can look at white flight. Going from the cities to the suburbs. We see this post World War II in particular, where because of the ability to have the kind of money to buy a small house, you could buy property in the rural areas. And because of the development of the car and the interstate highway system, you could commute from the rural areas into the cities and back again in the evening. And that meant you could have your little split ranch house in the suburbs and your white picket fence and the swing set and raise your kids in the suburbs and stuff and still work in one of those big CBD skyscrapers downtown. So we see the movement of people out of the urban areas into the suburbs. And then we see that filtering process of African Americans, Hispanics, and other groups that move then into those residential areas that the white folks just left. And those become ethnic neighborhoods. They become the barrios. They become these areas of ethnic identity that we often see in cities today. So again, that changes the composition of our cities. Up until that point, places like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland were predominantly white. And as they move out, then suddenly our cities become more ethnically diverse, for one, and we start seeing larger communities of African Americans, Asians, Hispanic, and whatever. And so they take the place of those what used to be white neighborhoods. And when we get into urbanization, you'll see what the result of all that is. Anyway, so keep that. That's another migration, and it's a significant one. They may well ask about it. This may help. It's a weird place to put it, but I'm going to throw it out there. Remember your belts. When I say the Sun Belt migration, I'm talking about that southern tier of U.S. states that have hot climates. That's the Sun Belt. And so you may well be having somebody mentioning in a multiple choice question something about the Corn Belt or the Sun Belt or the Rust Belt. Ooh, there's a good one too. Um, where it may be describing a certain part of the United States. You might want to remember your belts. Corn Belt, that's the Midwest. Where do we grow corn? That just kind of makes sense. But that's our agricultural center. And so if you're talking about anything with the Corn Belt, you're talking about that middle part of the United States. Southern Sun Belt, again. Rust Belt is the area that is deindustrialized in the United States. That's your Detroits, your Pittsburghs, your Clevelands, your Toledos, places like that where the urban industrial jobs have moved away. And again, that goes back to industry, doesn't it? So this is something that ties and explains maybe why people are moving and where they're moving because of deindustrialization. A new term I've seen a lot recently is brownlands, which is kind of a new term to describe the Rust Belt. When they're talking about brownlands, they're talking about areas of the country that have deindustrialized, that the factories have been abandoned, the population is declining, it's often poverty struck because there's no jobs. Sometimes you might see that one. I'm just going to throw that out there just in case you see it. I've seen it more often recently than in the past, so it's potentially a term you might see. There are some other weird ones out there as far as the belts go. There's the Bible Belt, which tells you that that part of the country is very religious and often very religiously conservative as well. So that's the southern part of the United States, that perceptual region. Bible Belt, South, they kind of overlap. I have heard, and I've never seen it, but I suspect one day we will, is the Jello Belt, and that's referring to the area of the Rocky Mountains where the Mormons live. And if you know Mormons, you will know the significance of Jello, and that's where it got its name. It's one of those sweet treats that you can have that, according to their own food restrictions, they can actually eat. Because they have food restrictions. And so Jello is very popular in Utah and places like that. Snow belt, that may be another one you see. That is the upper tier of states where they tend to get blizzards and heavy snow and stuff. You might see snow belt. I guess that one's kind of self-evident, but whatever. Anyway, but think about the different forms of migration. Think about how migration plays a role in things like industrialization, deindustrialization, as we move away from agriculture. So it could come up in agriculture. If we're starting to look at gender again, who's migrating or who's not migrating, according to Ravenstein or Zelensky, that could be an issue. Can women migrate on their own or not in these societies? That may tell you something about the society if they can't do that. So think about stuff like that. And again, if it was me, I would go back and look at some of those big migrations in U.S. history, because if they're going to refer to one, it's going to be something specific like that. And, what time period, where did they go, why were they leaving, stuff like that. So I would look at those. At this point, I'm going to bring migration to a close. See you again.